Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me for today's Vulva Love Club podcast. If you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself. Who are you? What is it that you do?
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here talking to you. So my name is Rachel Piazza. I am a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt with around 16 years of experience. I'm an adjunct professor of women's and gender studies, and I'm the founder of a program called Feminist Self-Defense, which is an empowerment self-defense program. My sort of journey to this place, um, I think was somewhat interesting. I started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu after undergrad and then decided to go back and get a master's in women's studies degree. And so I was kind of taking these two very different yet oddly complementary paths, this idea of, using your body in this powerful way. Um, but also in this very male-dominated sport of, combat sports, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And seeing really, as I was sort of deepening and broadening my understanding of gender-based violence and just gender-based oppression in the world, really noticing how the world of self-defense was lacking. And these traditional self-defense programs that, were mostly focused on stranger danger, on like these really maybe overtly violent physical skills to fight off some attacker while you're out running at night. And we know, that these types of scenarios are horrific and they do occur, but they're not the majority of the harm that people experience. And so while I think many of these programs are well-meaning, right, they're kind of hitting the mark as far as what scenarios people are being trained for, and they're also not particularly trauma-informed. Um, Oftentimes taught by sort of this hyper-masculine, military type instructor, and I heard many stories about how these types of programs were not only not helpful, but also potentially traumatizing or harmful in themselves. And so I set out to kind of just teach some physical skills to people who are vulnerable to gender-based violence that were more applicable. Things like, somebody who's already close to you because it's somebody that you know, right? Physically close in. How can I use my body to create boundaries between me and this person? And so I've been teaching these workshops for 10 years, and along the way, I discovered the empowerment self-defense model, which is, and I think, Heather, you were saying you had some experience with this, but adds in this amazing verbal boundary setting component. And this was something that I had to catch up to in order to teach, right? Because like everybody else who was socialized to, be polite, to kind of make myself smaller, to fear violence, and therefore maybe keep my mouth shut or be afraid to set a boundary. This was a more difficult journey for me to be able to learn it myself and then to be able to teach it. But over the years, I really started implementing more verbal boundary setting into my workshops and, really saw how people came in wanting to learn, how to fight, but left feeling super empowered with the verbal strategies and feeling like they could use these right away, and that practicing them was sort of this liberating feeling of being able to speak up for oneself. Um, and so within that, right, this empowerment self-defense model is also understanding that violence is a social problem rooted in oppression. So the victim blaming, or this idea that, we're responsible for preventing somebody from causing us harm, is just, antithetical to what we're doing in empowerment self-defense, and really just helping to sort of challenge those social norms that teach us to make ourselves smaller, or that allow us, that maybe prime us to not set boundaries. And be more vulnerable to violence because of that. And so that's sort of the snapshot, the quick snapshot of what empowerment self-defense is, and my my journey to it and teaching it.
It's yeah, the reality, I hear you on having that very masculine instructor, this very violent thing. And the reality, right? We've got the data that it's more likely you'll be attacked by someone that you know. And
Right.
when we say attacked, like what are we meaning by this? But I think acknowledging a boundary being crossed rather than us being people pleasing and just allowing others to dominate the space and do whatever they want to us, whether it's just talking at us, approach us, touch us, or whatever that might be. Actually, we are worthy of having boundaries. And
And that isn't that just the lesson, right, to take away that we often, by mo behavior that's been modeled for us or messages that we've gotten, that is not what we've internalized.
yeah,
And so what you're touching on, right, is this idea of the continuum of violence that you might say attacked or that harm, violence is caused. But what we're looking at is really something as simple, can be as simple, and I put it in air quotes, right, because um, it actually is quite harmful. But the smaller boundary violations that happen, whether it's somebody speaking over you or standing closer to you, taking up your space, whether that's intentional or not, but is sort of embedded into our cultural norms that my body, my space doesn't matter, right? But you're able to take up space, dominate in this way that either is intentional or is unintentional, and how those things really form this foundation that more overt forms of violence are sort of exist on that continuum where they can escalate or they kind of just set the stage for the normalization of domination, of boundary violations that occur for people who are marginalized.
yeah. And it's so, yeah, I get you. It's so simple. It's so basic, but yet here we are having to train, to study it, to understand it, to acknowledge it. It's not been something that's necessarily accessible and available for people. I wonder if you could just explain. So, yeah, I've been to a session, so I understand that there was this element, the practical. So it was like we are taking on some sort of, yeah, exercise, some practical activity. And then there was this element of the emotional boundary setting.
Mm,
And so the example for that I experienced both here in Iceland, but I actually randomly got a job in a sex club. I never started doing the job, but I learned so much about consent whilst
mm,
exploring that. There's a lot to be learned from
mm,
sex clubs. That's one of the oldest practices that exists. But the part of the training was this boundary setting. So if someone comes towards you, just telling them where your limit is, telling them where to stop. And that's what I found in this other session as well, that actually was part of this feminist self-defense practice. So I wonder if you can just explain what a session with you looks like, and some of the tools, maybe just touch on some of the elements of a session, please.
yeah, of course. It sounds like the course that you took was fantastic. Um, Yeah, so I like to sort of, and it depends on the length of the session, but I essentially break it down into a few parts. So first, that we discuss essentially what power-based violence or gender-based violence looks like in our world, how it's normalized, and how it shows up in our lives. So we can kind of start to understand the context and separate ourselves from sort of being implicit in or somehow responsible for preventing it, understanding that this is embedded in our culture, right? And then understand, so then doing some, and I would love to hear, I heard you do some somatic practices. And so I'm a big fan and I like to introduce some sort of grounding work, right? Because if we can be more present in our bodies and understand the signals that our body is sending us, right? Do we experience a tightening of the chest or a flip-flop in the stomach when our boundaries been crossed? Even in the most tiniest, like you might not consciously be aware of it, or your conscious mind might immediately say, oh, that was nothing, right? I want this person to like me, or I want to fit in, so I'm gonna shove that away. But let's allow that, and being present with our bodies allow us to have more information and what we can do with that information. Oh, you know what? I felt that way. What does that mean about, this interaction or that person or this scenario? And I think that then that leads us to understanding a bit more about what our boundaries actually are. And so really thinking through, we're not going to know our boundary in every session, every scenario or instance. Sometimes, and those boundaries can change depending on a million different factors. But I like to think about, and I'll explain boundaries as not the limit of what we'll accept, right? Because if we think about a boundary as the absolute limit, it's only when a situation starts to approach that absolute limit that we think, oh, this is a violation of my boundary. Instead, if we think about boundaries as what we need in order to feel safe and at ease, then when something starts to alert us that we're not feeling safe and at ease, then we can start to, oh, wait a second, that's outside of that boundary, but it's not at our absolute limit. And so we have time to sort of do something in that space, if that's making sense.
Mm.
Um, and so kind of narrowing in this idea that my boundary is what makes me feel safe and at ease. And my body is going to alert me when I'm not feeling safe and at ease, or when something happens and I know, well, you know what, that wasn't what I needed or wanted. Then we need to attach some practical skills to that, because we don't have the practical skills to set a boundary. So we may know that our boundary is being violated in some way, whether that's in a small way or a big way, but not have a strategy to go to. And so that's when some verbal boundary setting strategies comes into play. And so in a session with me, we usually start with a very simple boundary setting activity that can kind of, everything that I do is fun and pretty, the stakes are pretty low, right? Because we want to feel safe in the space. And so we'll do like a ball toss where you just have to say no to something that somebody says, right? Oh, can I borrow, that sweater? It's really cold in here. And so there's the part of you that wants to allow your friend to borrow your sweater, but your job is to say no, right? And so getting people to say no in social interactions, and role playing this through this ball toss, really brings out a lot of discomfort in people. And we'll watch everybody do this ball toss and they have to say no. And at the end, I say, what did you notice about how you felt and about what you observed? Oh, well, everybody was laughing because it was uncomfortable. Oh, I saw that people apologized for saying no, right? And so we can start to observe in each other how really challenging it is to just simply say no, especially, and it's funny because it'll be a joke, but some of the asks that people do in this ball toss, like, oh, can I eat your lunch? The question is, kind of over the top. But we're somehow then the ones apologizing for not acquiescing to that request. And so it's interesting for everybody to sort of observe what our natural inclination is when it comes to saying no. And then from there, we'll do other types of boundary setting exercises and strategies. One that I'd love to go over a little bit later, I think as like a helpful tip. And then we'll proceed into physical boundary setting skills. And I start with what I consider social boundary setting, where you can be polite, because a lot of times a boundary, I think we have in our mind that self-defense means that we have to scream no, or do something really over the top or out of our comfort zone. But I think that if that's our only option, many times we're not going to do that, right? And so what fits into our no, our social norms that we can actually implement? And so, something as simple as turning a hug into a handshake or a front hug into a side hug. Um, or if somebody comes and puts their arm around you, what are some ways that you can still show kindness to that person, whether it's because you want to or whether because you think the consequence of not is too great, right? It could be a boss, it could be a family member, a number of different scenarios why you might choose politeness. And politeness can be a tool that we can use. And of course, I empower and encourage everybody to use whatever, right, strategy, whether it's the opposite of politeness, because sometimes that's what the situation calls for, but that you have options. And so we'll start with those social boundary setting skills and then slowly escalate to, more overtly sort of aggressive or threatening situations if somebody grabs your wrist or comes up from behind or, because my background is in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I have a lot of skills on the ground, right? So if I'm on my back, what can I do to defend myself if the situation is overtly violent? What can I do to create distance in potentially an intimate situation that I want to feel like I have physical control in? So it might be putting the heels on the hip bones and creating space so that you understand, right, in practicing this, that in a very vulnerable position where you think you might not have any options, that you've got this ability to create space. And so that's sort of the trajectory of my workshops, really starting with the social context, moving into those social emotional skills, the physical boundary setting, and then kind of bringing everybody back together for some more grounding because, we want to make sure that everybody's feeling good and a
Yeah.
little bit settled after.
Yeah, definitely, because even though it's role play, the nervous system doesn't
Oh,
necessarily
yes.
know that. So there's going to be
Right.
some activation. And I think also from a somatic, from the embodied perspective, like when we allow practice, like you say, some things might be small or simple, but how we're socialized impacts the relationships that we have and the interactions that we have so much. So when we're able to practice doing something in a safe place,
Mm,
whether it is just saying no, which is such a huge thing for so many people, a difficult, challenging thing for so
mm,
many people, then it becomes easier to be able to do it when necessary, if necessary. Um, and so
absolutely.
I love that it's not just the practical element of this violence or, creep on the street, but it is giving yourself the empowerment to be able to manage your relationships. That's the point of a boundary, right? It's not just to
Absolutely.
keep so many people out, it's also to ensure the people that we care for, loved ones, can remain in our life in a way
And
that feels right.
isn't that just eye-opening? And when I discovered that, right? Because we do think about boundaries as keeping people away or keeping things we don't want out. But actually, boundaries allow us to deepen our relationships and have more healthy relationships with ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and I think this is my thing from my perspective of teaching sex education, that when we get to know ourselves, because a lot of what you're talking about is getting to know our boundaries. When do we
Mm,
ever spend time on our own to get to know what we're into, what we're not into?
mm,
But this impacts all of the aspects of our lives. So to be able to tap into and create space to feel into and to have permission to know that it's not only necessary, it's your right to have a
mm.
boundary and know where your limits are, I think is pretty radical, right? For so many people, it's huge.
Huge, huge. And then you're right, it's just something that is not taught. And this, hopefully we get to the place where we teach, and I think we're starting to, where we teach children more about this but the people who are teaching the children need to know themselves, right? And so this is something that we're all just sort of very basic and fundamental, yet kind of radical, and this new way of being and interacting in the world.
Yeah. Has there been anything that you've found? Well, two things. I'm curious about the people that you work with, the people that you support, and the impact or any insights and revelations that people have had stepping into this, maybe having one idea of how it might
Hmm.
be, and having a huge breakthrough, perhaps, maybe.
Well, I'll tell you, the reason that I have continued to do this since I started, over 10 years ago is because so many times the response people just it's this light bulb moment that goes off, and it's so fulfilling from my standpoint, and like that's just what feeds me to keep going is people just look at me. Number one, I didn't think I was physically able to do any of that, right? They think, whoa, I'm so much more capable than I perceived myself to be. And that can be this like moment of like, holy crap, and very empowering. Two, that people come in feeling, right, like ready to roll, fighting wise, and then they realize, oh, setting verbal boundaries is so hard, and I didn't realize, right? Like this realization that they actually struggle where they maybe didn't recognize before. And then being able to connect that to like a strategy that is easy to use, it feels like very liberating. And so, I mean, just time and again, every workshop that I teach, there's some sort of like aha moment that people have from this work. Um, and that's why it just keeps me like, oh, okay, like there's the need for this, and people are responding to it in this really profound way. And what seems simple, really, right, is like we said, very quite profound and radical for people to experience.
I'm also curious about your own journey, your own relationship with this. And like you mentioned before, coming from a jujitsu background and it being very masculine, but also how this work has showed up in your personal life. Yeah. Yeah. How's it been for you? How are you doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. you know, in 10 plus years. Yeah, so I guess, in starting when I started jujitsu, I was an athlete my whole life. I played softball, and so coming into jujitsu, I felt very powerful. I was a staunch like feminist, and I felt very physically like I was ready to kind of like that person I'm telling you who comes into my sessions, right? Like feeling like, oh yeah, like I am. And then, I think it's through my own journey in therapy and doing a lot of somatic work in my therapy as well, that I really started like to see, oh, this physical exterior that I was bringing that was like very tough was masking in a lot of ways this vulnerability, and also this real difficulty with knowing boundaries and setting boundaries. Having just friendships where you could speak your truth. And
Mhm.
I am still working on this today, but I used to be the person who, and I'm sure people can relate to this, like if somebody wanted to do something, like I would be so out of touch with my boundaries that I'd be invited someplace, but not ever be able to like actually confirm that I could go because I'd be so anxious and trepidatious about like I might not have the space when it comes to do that to socialize. And I spent a lot of time sort of sheltered because
Mhm.
I wasn't able to kind of have clearer communication or boundaries or just say, you know what, that's not my thing. I don't think I'll go, right? And be empowered to say that. And so just very slowly in my own life did I start to be able to understand myself, understand my emotional self, and set boundaries with people that I know. And I mean, like many of us probably in our own lives can just reflect back and like, holy cow, like I was so dysregulated
Mhm. Mhm.
in, knowing what I wanted in relationships or in dating, scenarios, and then feeling overwhelmed, feeling not always able to communicate my needs and desires, and feeling like my boundaries were violated. And it was all very chaotic
Mhm.
in my internal experience, right? And so I do an instructor training program, and I tell new instructors that I'm training, like, you will learn alongside the students that you're teaching. And that nobody is the expert in this stuff, right? We are all learning and we're all on our own journey with it. And so as you teach, you observe, you learn too. And so you don't have to be, up here kind of teaching down to people. No, we're on this journey together. And I think that, the people that you teach appreciate that transparency, that there's not something inherently wrong with you if you're unable to do this right now or you struggle. Um, and so yeah, this interesting sort of dichotomy between the physical and the verbal.
Mhm.
I think they complement each other, but I think that just observing myself, the physical skills, unless you encounter one of those stranger danger attacks where you're able to physically fight off the majority of that harm that is caused, it is the verbal skills, the knowing of yourself that can help you navigate the majority of those situations. And I think that I have I've experienced that reality. And, and it's also why I'm so, I think, enthusiastic about teaching both of these sides, right? You cannot just have the physical and think that that trickles over to the emotional and verbal, because it may a little, but not much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey with that. I think it's so important. So often we think, oh, this person knows best. And it's easy for us to give up our autonomy, thinking
Mm,
that someone else will have agency over us and know what's best for us. But again, it's about coming into the self and really feeling what feels right and
mm,
recognizing where what feels right is as well and getting familiar with that. There's
mm,
something just come up for me about how when we are disconnected from ourselves, I can think of a time when I did something, I went along with something, but
mm.
the voice in my head was the other end on a different page.
Yes.
And I think that's the trickiness. I don't think we can have this conversation without mentioning consent. There's so much in the world of consent, and we refer to it as the grey because how black and white can it ever be? What's implied, your interpretation of something versus mine. But the reality that even we might consent to something when another part of us is not feeling it or not into it. So yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but it's the reality that a lot of people face, right? That we have disconnected from ourselves massively.
Oh, I think I mean, I've had this experience as well. And I think probably so many people have. And that's, how do we talk about it? How do we grapple with that? Um, and right, I think this work is part of untangling and being able to pay attention to, even if that one part of the part of yourself says, wait a second, no, but then the other part of yourself is going forward, right? Or continuing it's, you know, um, and giving pause, right? Sometimes it might just be giving pause to rectify, like, wait a second, what is it I'm feeling? Because I'm feeling there's a conflict here. There's part of me, and why is this part of me doing this? And why is this part of me feeling this way? And perhaps if I can give pause to this and allow some space and time. And I think that the pause is a really actually helpful tool, right? Because there's a lot of pressure in the moment of an interaction. You just the trajectory, sort of the momentum is going in one direction, right? And so it would take to kind of stop that momentum and be decisive about what you want sometimes takes more than your brain has figured out yet. And so the pause can be an easier way to step back and kind of make sense of those different parts. And so the pause could be using the bathroom is
Yeah.
a good pause, right? It doesn't always have to be like, you don't always have to figure out exactly the accurate way to describe how you're feeling or what you need in that moment, right? Pause. I need a drink. I need to go to the bathroom. Whatever it is, gives you a pause. And then in that space, you may have a better chance to figure out what these different parts are saying and maybe how you want to proceed taking that into account. Um,
Thank you.
I
Yeah,
think that's useful, but I think it also takes a lot to get there, to be able to notice all the things you need to notice, to pause. And I will say, and I want to just say, if you're listening to this and feel like, oh, I wish I knew better, because then I wouldn't have dealt with all those, difficult feelings and the harm that came. We know what we know when we know it. And there is, and our bodies sometimes will take over to take care of us the best way the body knows how. And so if that's dissociation or if that's compliance, there is nothing wrong with that. And so I think, removing the shame or the guilt of not responding the way after the fact you wish you had, in the moment, your body took over. And so I think that that's just important to bring up.
absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that because I think with my example of my mind thinking one
Yeah.
thing and being like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
But there was a disconnect from the body to be able to make changes. And it was the observation that there was the voice in my head that thought something. Huge journey with this, alongside fight and flight. We've also got
Mm.
freeze and fawn, and
Mhm.
understanding that, like you just said, our mind is
Yeah.
trying to keep us safe in those times. So yeah, shame and guilt is not going to achieve anything, but
Yeah.
nurturing that relationship with self to better
Mhm.
understand in these scenarios and situations, maybe I react this way, or even just witnessing, I'm noticing some conflict within, and just the pause, just pop to the look, just time out, hang on a minute, let me just check in, because if that's not a familiar practice for you,
Right.
it can be difficult to introduce. Like, I don't know how to do this isn't familiar, but
Right.
it is just, I'm just going to pop to the loo. I'm just need a drink. Could I just get a drink? Yeah. Yeah.
And I think too, if we can practice that in other scenarios that are maybe less intense, right? Anytime that we're feeling, and just create that as a practice. I need a moment, I need a pause, right? If so a lot of times in my workshops, I do introduce these sort of low ask, or less intense scenarios that we can practice these things in. And one of the things, like, what do you have a hard time saying if somebody asks you, right? Can you do me this favor? Rather than just blurting out an answer, because the answer that you just blurt out will probably be what you're most used to saying. Sure, I can do that. Or, when it comes to, for me, if somebody in the past asked about my pricing, I might just say, I'll do it for free. Or I'll undersell and so I started to learn, pause, don't give them an answer. If I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying the right thing, pause, let me get back to you. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. I'll write up a proposal, whatever it is, so that I'm not blurting out. And so the same type of practice, right? If you know you always say yes when so and so asks you for a favor, next time, let me get back to you. Because saying no might be so far out of your comfort zone in that moment that you're not actually going to do it. But what you might be able to do is pause and then later write a text that says no, right? Something that's a little bit easier so that you can start to gain that skill more slowly and in situations that maybe aren't as intense and you don't send you into that like physiological threat response.
Yeah, I definitely hear that when the stakes are lower. And although the stakes might be lower with loved ones and people that we believe care about us, sometimes, firstly, let's just say those relationships might not be sincere or safe.
Mm,
That can happen. But also when someone is so used to you responding in a certain way, for you to appease their needs, for you to be a yes person all of the time, for you to then change. Like, whoa, hang on a minute, what's going on? So the ones I do think the ones that hang around, the ones that we are able to communicate our needs and our boundaries with and just say, hey, I'm just exploring some stuff at the minute. I'd love to practice this with you. Not all of our relationships do we feel able to communicate in this way, but my God, are they not the relationships that are worth nurturing? This is
mm,
me. This is how I'm showing up in relationships. I'm exploring some stuff here. And just to say that anyone that doesn't get that or isn't into it, why is this the company that you're keeping? But isn't this the company that we've been keeping for so long?
mm,
And actually, we're doing a disservice to them and ourselves in the fact that maybe we're not showing up as our true self. They're getting this performance, they're getting this
yeah,
version of us.
yeah.
And that lack of alignment, why live a life like that? So it's yeah, like you said, it's so simple. It's huge. It's
It can
so big.
feel actually impossible. Like it can feel like, how could I possibly utter something different? And so that's why I think like we celebrate those tiny, tiny little changes that we make that may be nearly imperceptible. But you know what? Instead of, blurting out what I normally do or, whatever it is that you just create that little bit of change for, notice that and appreciate that for yourself because it can feel physically impossible. And I've watched people even in these role plays where saying no feels like you are like pulling out some sort of like impossible task that their butt to say it feels like such a struggle, physical struggle. That's how deeply embedded, right? Like um our communication and then in certain relationships or certain dynamics, it's wildly difficult. So,
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because for many people, family will be the person or the people that you've been in a relationship with the longest.
yeah.
I would say the relationship we have the longest is with ourselves,
Mm,
but we're not always conscious in that relationship.
mm,
But with family, I think there's also this role, this expectation that you play this role that would be potentially different to romantic or platonic relationships, in that you are the child or you are the parent,
mm,
whichever way around it is, you are the sibling. And so if they've known you since you were a child,
mm,
then changing, making these shifts and adjustments is work. It is work. But like you
mm.
said, it's a practice in the same way that any sort of training you do, it takes practice to improve these skills. But do you have any tips and tricks? Yeah. Are there things that, I mean, you've shone some light on some things that people can introduce and acknowledging that it does take time. But yeah, do you have anything that you'd like to share?
So I thought that I would share one of my favorite boundary setting strategies. And
Love this.
this is a very popular strategy. People love to do it. And it's actually the way that I run it is through a role play. So, Heather, if you're up for it, we can role play. Okay, so the idea here is the broken record method of boundary setting. So if you think about a broken record, what does a broken record do? It just skips, repeats, repeats, repeats. And
Mm.
so what I find and how we usually set boundaries is people like to soften their no or their boundary. They like to make excuses why they can't do the thing, the ask. Um, and a manipulative person, right, or somebody who's wanting to push the boundary and get their way can easily manipulate an excuse or can capitalize on a softer approach. And so if you're up for it, if you don't mind being a boundary pusher,
Oh, okay, yeah.
I am going to demonstrate how oftentimes people will set a boundary. So the strategy or the scenario that I usually do is like you're at a party and somebody's trying to get you to leave the party with them. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a friend of a friend, whatever. And so you're going to be trying to get me to leave the party, and I'm going to set a boundary in an average way. And so we'll
Okay.
just play that out for a minute.
Oh, this is great because also
Okay.
I'm cancelling plans. So I love the idea of I've gone to the party, but you know what? I think I've had enough. Rachel, are you nearly done? Are you ready to go now? I'd really love to leave.
Heather, I'm gonna stay with my friends here at the party.
No, come on. We came together. Come on. It's done. We
Well,
can.
it's just that, my friends wanted me to stay with them, and so, at this party, I mean, it's not so bad. I'm gonna have like another drink probably.
Yeah, but we could go back. We could just chill. We could just catch up. Just us, just away from, everybody else.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't think so. It's how about maybe we do that another night. I have a test in the morning, so like I can't stay up too late anyway.
Okay. So you're not gonna come with me, really?
Okay.
I
So,
feel the discomfort, the rejection.
right? So what happened, right? I wanted to stay with my friends. You sort of took this approach of like, but you don't, we came together, right? So there was a guilt there. Now there's this like pool for loyalty, right?
Mm.
Is that loyalty pool gonna work on me, right? Then but we could chill together. Okay, so now there's this alternative. This person's like, I'm obviously, they're not
Yeah,
taking
no,
my
yeah,
reason, right?
yeah.
So then I changed my reason. I have to be up early. So then, right, so it's just this, and then notice that the conversation just keeps on going. And so it's getting harder for me to come up with new reasons or to legitimize my excuse. Okay, so it was just like this very mucky, difficult interaction.
Uncomfortable,
I'm
yeah.
feeling I'm feeling guilty. Oh, I think because I'm not wanting to hurt your feelings, but I'm still trying to stick to my boundary, right? It's this whole thing. Okay, so now we're going to do the broken record method. And so with this broken record method, I'm going to set my boundary, I'm going to repeat, and then I'm going to end the interaction. Okay, so I want to try to repeat the exact phrase or a similar phrase so that I'm not reaching for other things. I just stick to that. Okay, so let's give it another go.
Just getting into character. Rachel, are you nearly done? Shall we head off now?
Oh, Heather, I'm actually going to stay for a little bit with my friends.
Are you sure? Let's just go. Let's just go.
No, I'm going to stay a little bit with my friends, but I'll catch up with you next week. See you later.
Why don't you want to come with me?
Bye. Walking away.
Yeah, yeah.
So your attempt, right? Then you're trying to, but when you're like, well, why? You're trying to keep that conversation going, but I've shut the conversation down. I stayed friendly within the conversation, right? Hey, I'll catch up with you next week, but I'm staying. I'm staying, catch up with you next week. See you later, right? Ending the interaction in some way. So if I can get up and leave, if I can, and of course, like, so this is a framework that you can use, but it obviously the many nuances of a interaction may necessitate changing it. If somebody comes up to you, you can just end the interaction right away. You don't have to, you can
Yeah.
set the boundary on the interaction. You don't have to repeat. But this is just something that gives you something to go to so that you're not floundering. Would you like to try?
Do I get to set the boundary?
Yeah.
Okay. I am the one that leaves early, but yes, go ahead. I'm really loving it. I'm enjoying it.
I will. Okay, so I'll help you with that. Okay, you ready?
Hmm.
Oh, Heather. Oh, I think we sit next to each other in chemistry class. I'm doing this like we're college students because I work with
Okay.
college students a lot of times. Oh, you sit next to me in chemistry class. Hey, I heard about this other party. It's just getting started. Why don't we go?
You know what? I'm good here. I'm okay here. I'm enjoying this.
But this party is super lame. It's like nobody's here. It's totally dying down. I heard this next party is going to be the best. So just, I'll walk you there. It'll be fine. Let's go.
Yeah, like I said, I'm good. If you want to go, you go, but I'm just gonna stay. Thanks.
Oh, that's super lame.
I'm walking away.
How did that feel?
It's an interest. It definitely makes me. There's a strength and a power that comes in repeating the thing that you're
Yeah.
saying. There can be a
Yeah.
frustration if you're going to continue to repeat it, but that, no, no. Rather than, like you say, scrambling for any, well, let's try this one. Is that a good fit? Is that excuse going to work?
That didn't work. That one didn't work. But actually, when you repeat the boundary, it becomes stronger not only for the person hearing it, but for you too.
Yeah.
And if there's a frustration that I've repeated this boundary now, good, right? There should be. Use that.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm saying this again, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think I told you this was the boundary. And so, it strengthens it, and it really, I think, strengthens the resolve of the person who's saying the boundary when they repeat it. Um,
Yeah. And
and
just respect of those boundaries. Go on, what were you going to say?
no, no, it's just I don't even remember what I was gonna say.
Just in the boundary world. Yeah, there's the respect of it. And I do think it's so important. The company that we keep, if you can't respect my boundaries, I don't have to tolerate you. And it might mean that your social circles, your relationships shrink. But why are we letting waste man, like complete energy drainers, suckers,
Mm, mm.
have a VIP front row seat into our ecosystem? Like, what are you contributing to this? No.
So when we use these strategies, it gives us a ton of information, right? If I say no and somebody pushes back, okay, I hear that, right? Like logged. If I repeat that boundary and they push back again, that is like big red flags. Whether that's a friend who's just trying to get you to do the thing that they want to do, right? Or something that could be even more dangerous.
Mm,
Um, we're getting a ton of information. But if we're wishy-washy, we're trying to save that person's feelings and we're not giving clear boundaries, then, we're not able to kind of glean that information, right? Yeah, maybe a person can be really good at knowing, reading the subtext, right? I'm
mhm,
giving excuses and what I really mean is no. Sure, right? I think many of us are very good at that and would take, okay, right? But if we're able, and so sometimes in an interaction, we might say, well, maybe I just wasn't clear enough.
mm,
Oh, why did that person? And then rather than seeing that person and getting information about that person, we question ourselves, right? So can we communicate and show up in a way that we can be friendly if we want to, but we're very clear about what we're planning on doing, what our boundary is, and then realizing that if a person continues to push forward, that is information that's really important. And then we can use that, to base decisions on about who we're spending our time with.
It's it's such a handy tool. It's of course the the thing about red flags is I'm a huge advocate for green flag hunting because when we recognize
Mhm.
what feels good, where it feels in the body, get our nervous system, if we pivot towards the green flags, then red flags don't even have to be slapping us in the face. They stay over there in the distance.
Right.
And I was just thinking then that, depending on what these dynamics are, these interactions, these relationships, we don't want to apply red flags to our nearest and dearest,
Mm.
or a fear of, we don't want to upset them, or we don't want to come across a bad person. We want to fit in, we want to have these friendships. But recognizing that those red flags, if those dynamics do not make you feel safe, if you feel that you can't speak your truth without being, respected, then what service is that dynamic to you? So I think but it can also be a shock to the system when we see those red flags in people that are in our inner circles.
Oh, for sure. Right. And that's, I think, one of maybe the most difficult things about doing this type of work, right? Is like we probably do a lot to protect other people from our recognition that they might, like we don't want to go there. And so, even being in the space that you would be okay going there and recognizing that maybe somebody who you want to have in your life might have this harmful influence, right? That the dynamic is toxic for you. Um, and who knows what that means, right? Does that mean that person has to go, or does that dynamic have to change? And I think that can, both of those things are possible, right? I would probably say, I'm like always telling people like, go to therapy. Therapy can be great, right? Like, because you need help and support. You doing this stuff every step of the way. If you're going to change a dynamic, you need probably you're going to need support, professional support with people who know how to do these things and teach us. Because if we're left to our own devices, right, we're not taught this stuff.
And just end up doing more harm. Okay, so you've just reminded me of a guy that I used to know. I was volunteering for a little while in Greece, working with refugees. I don't know if that's an important detail or not, but anyway,
Mhm.
one of my colleagues had started seeing a girl, and then he'd met another girl, and he liked the other girl, but he'd got into something. They were going steady, let's say, with this first girl. And he was explaining to me that he met this new girl, he really likes her. And I said, so you're going to tell the girl that you're seeing? He's like, no, no, because the need to protect her feelings was,
Mm,
no, I don't want to hurt her. I don't want to upset her.
mm.
Firstly, what a dick. Firstly, you're not showing up as your true self and being sincere. And
Mm,
secondly, you're not respecting this person that you're
mm,
being intimate with to give them a sense of agency to make an informed decision about what's going on. Instead, you're blindfolding her and keeping hush hush how you actually feel. And that's not cool. That's not respect. That's not hot. That's not okay.
mhm.
But it just made me think about this example of this people pleasing, trying to protect other people. For what? From who?
Yes. And this just came up for me recently too, right? Which is I am not showing my boundary, right? Because I want to somehow protect you from my feelings being hurt or from the fallout of you crossing my boundary. But I'm going to keep it to myself because do I trust that you can process and handle conflict? And maybe for some reason I don't trust that. That might not even be true, right? But like in this scenario, there's a lot going on there, right? But like if there's this like, oh, I hurting somebody's feelings is so you're so afraid of hurting somebody's feelings that you're then gonna create and prolong this harmful dynamic. And then who are you? I mean, and this is what fascinates me. Like, then who are you really hurting? Is it you? Is it you are trying to protect yourself from being the bad person who hurt the person?
Yes, I think that's it. I think that's it. But
And so
disguising
then,
it as
right, and then it all comes back to you. It all comes back to you and your ability to self-regulate and to know yourself, to show up with authenticity. I mean, it's like it just gets deeper and but actually more simple, right? Like peeling away the layers and of just allowing authenticity and communication. But then doing it in this world of where people are marginalized and some people try to have power over other people and it's all, but really kind of boiling it down and stripping away the layers, um, and showing up as your authentic self.
Yeah,
Like,
it's big work. It's a lot of work, a lot of practice, and I definitely 100% recommend getting professional support with it. But otherwise, who's gaining from showing up as somebody else or pretending,
mm,
pleasing to meet someone else's needs? Like, are you actually getting your needs satiated if you're performative?
mm-mm, mm-mm. Easier in the moment, I think, just ease.
Yeah.
Taking shortcuts, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
it's so hard.
yeah, it's making me think about how like we've touched on the reality that this can show up in romantic relationships and as well as platonic ones and familiar ones.
Yep.
Um, but I just want to take a moment just to speak to that. If it feels right for you, navigating relationships, navigating intimacy, particularly if you're coming from a place of low self-esteem. I'm not saying that you have to necessarily that you're a relationship coach or anything like this, but the reality of what you're seeing in the work that you
Yep.
do with boundaries, with empowerment, or coming from a place of struggling with empowerment and taking up space. Do you see the way that we interact in romantic relationships changing and improving with more people coming from this empowered place? Or is that just the world that we're in and maybe the professional, the personal development that we're doing? Um, how do you see this shaping the world?
Oh, for those who, yeah, can't see, I just clutched my pearls, leaned back in my seat. Ah, um,
No pressure.
and so you're asking, so like sort of like foreshadow, like how do I see in the future? Oh, I mean, I think this has alongside. So I want to say like this type of personal work that I teach and advocate for, right? Like along the lines of what we're talking about. Um, Being so critical to building just, our ability as individuals to build healthy relationships and moving forward in the world. But alongside that, right, the type of advocacy, social justice advocacy, because we're functioning as individuals in relationships, and that's sort of the micro, right? And that does influence the macro, right? Because our interactions can, as human beings, we're so malleable, and our interactions influence the people we're interacting with, who then influence the other people that, and so that's how, and then with social media and other educational tools, like we're just able to, create change that way. But also, alongside um, other types of advocacy work, legal changes and, you know, other efforts that can help sort of address the macro. But yeah, I mean, I think this work has huge, huge ramifications and potential. And that's why, like, we do it, right? Like, that's why I do it, right? To not only help the individual, but really to create better um, dynamics between uh, people who traditionally have had power and people who've had less power, people who've been socialized to make themselves smaller, right? Which doesn't do a service to anybody. Like we're talking about, if we want to engage with each other more authentically, stifling myself so that somebody else has the illusion of being a more powerful person than me uh, doesn't do anybody any real favors, right? But um, ultimately, right, the hope is that we can each show up as our authentic selves, embracing our uniqueness and our inherent power, right? Despite the labels and our identities and the boxes that society puts us in, that all types of power are respected and revered, right? Equally.
Mm.
That's the pie in the sky that I think, and having done, been in the feminist movement for enough time to have seen change happen now, right? You're like, wow, I remember, uh shouting and barking up a lot of trees that didn't seem to be care or listen, and now these are more, generally accepted ideas and principles. And so change does happen. And then we see the backlash to change, oftentimes, like we are experiencing here in the US. But we keep our eyes on the goal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something in that what we're speaking to is kind of the wound and
Mm,
also acknowledging the power, strength, in rage that we embody that's been shrunk or beaten out of us,
mm,
and recognizing that for some time divine feminine energy has
mm.
existed in all its images, all its ways of being, and we can draw strength from that.
Mm,
But the wound feels very prevalent, very present, very now, and it
mm,
would be easy to lose sight of that.
mm. I think that's an excellent reminder, right? That even when the outside world, right, is functioning on this illusion that their power is greater, um, not getting caught up. And it's so hard to say because everything's so complicated, but remembering the power within, whether or not it's disregarded from the outside.
And it's the same as boundaries, right? They're not necessarily visible for other people to see, but our strength and our boundaries is for us to feel,
Mm,
us to get a sense of
mhm,
where the limit
mhm,
is and where the limitlessness of our
mhm.
being is also. Yeah.
Yep,
Wow.
it's beautiful.
Rachel, is there anything else you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
Well, this conversation was just wonderful. I loved chatting with you. I'll share, I'm not great at social media, but I am on Instagram at Feminist Self-Defense. Um, my website is feministselfdefense.com, and you can reach out to me via email at booking@feministselfdefense.com. That's all I'd like to share.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Hopefully
Thank
people will come
you.
find you. And also just huge thank you and kudos to you for doing the work that you do and taking on this role and responsibility, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like that, but your contribution
Mm,
to society and building this sense
thank
of
you.
empowerment for the world as well. So thank you for you, especially in times like these.
Thank you so much.